Good morning and good year to everyone. ENT wants to welcome you to the first online talk of this year. For those who do not know, ENT has been organizing a series of online talks called PensamENTs in Catalan, which means thoughts in English. You can access to the videos of these talks in our YouTube channel. Today, we have the great pleasure to have Isabelle Anguelovski with us. She's an INCREA researcher and director of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, which is associated with the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology of the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Plus, she is an associate researcher at the Hospital de Mar Research Institute. Her main expertise is political ecology and environmental and urban planning, with a significant contribution on the topic of urban environmental justice. She is the author of various books and articles, and today we will have the pleasure to listen to the presentation entitled The Green City and Social Injustice, 21 Tales from North America and Europe, which is a new book edited by Isabelle and James Connolly. As usual, ENT online talks will include a 30 to 40-minute presentation part, followed by approximately 20-minute part dedicated to questions from the audience. Isabelle, thank you very much for being here on behalf of ENT. The floor is yours.
Hello, Luis. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me as Ignazi as well. It's a pleasure. It's been a long and nice ongoing collaboration with ENT and ICTA. And I'm really pleased to be here. And it's interesting because actually the book indirectly builds on some of the multi-stakeholder workshops that we organized as part of the European project Nativation, in which we all were, between ICTA and ENT, from a critical point of view, right? Looking at nature-based solutions and the social ramifications of these projects that cities are increasingly developing in different neighborhoods. So it's a very nice collaboration that I'm happy to see also flourish in different manners. Let me share my screen. Share screen up. Okay. All right. All right. Can you see it okay? Yeah. All right. So it's my pleasure to present the book on behalf of this whole team of 35 authors that have been part of the different chapters that we have in the book. The book is called The Green City and Social Injustice, and it was just published a month ago by Routledge in the series on urban sustainability and environmental justice that some of you might know. One of the main editors, Julian Agiuman, who is a professor who has coined the term just sustainabilities. And so for us, the idea behind the book is to look at the way in which the Green City, yes, reproduces social injustice, but also can move beyond different types of inequalities that are recreated within the Green City to produce more just and sustainable and inclusive cities for all. Just to give you a little bit of very brief background, the book is also linked to the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, BCNUEJ, that both James and I co-direct, and which is organized around a series of questions or themes that we examine from both a research standpoint, but also more an advocacy, a policy and community advocacy standpoint. And so you can see here that one of the main themes is environmental and climate gentrification, which is what we work on in the book more specifically, but then also the book is also linked to other themes that we work on, for example, financialization and housing justice, how in some ways green inequalities in the city cannot be reproduced without also considering financial flows, real estate investment flows that allow in the end capital investment and capital appropriation, value appropriation from green projects by investors and by real estate developers. We also have a lot of emphasis in our work on health and equity in the city, and that also permeates the book, we hope quite nicely, by looking at both long-term impacts and lasting impacts of environmental toxic in environmental justice neighborhoods, but also in the ways in which urban greening, yes, has positive ramifications for physical and mental health, but maybe actually not for all residents, only those who are privileged enough to be able to come live or stay living in greener neighborhoods. So the two questions that motivated us with the book are the following. How can planning move away from urban greening being embedded into politics of unequal redevelopment, competitive urbanism, and land speculation? And also, how can green cities be truly just and emancipatory for all, rather than a driver of new social and racial injustices? And the reason why we put a bit this bold statement about green cities being unequal is based on the empirics of the book, right? Which is a study of 21 mid-sized globalizing cities. We're not looking at smaller cities where greening might not be embedded into those different dynamics that I'm describing here. But we're looking at cities that are exposed to international flows of information exchange, investment, global investment, financialization, competitive branding, and just in general, a city being kind of a piece in a game of other dynamics of capital accumulation and value extraction for a few. So one of the main ideas also then behind the book is that unequal access to green space, environmental racism, and housing discrimination are deeply intertwined. They've been for decades, and they continue to be intertwined now. So if we look, for example, at Barcelona, and let's say the history of access to green space, we see that it is unequal. If you live in neighborhoods like Sant Andreu or in districts like Sant Andreu, Nou Barris, you have lesser access to green space. You are more exposed to environmental toxics, even when actually you have new green spaces being created for you. In El Parc de la Trinidad that you see on the right, it was a new park created in the 90s with then, and let's say underpinned by an equality discourse, and a discourse that working class neighborhoods have the right to also live in more green environments, but you can still see the exchanges of highway systems and networks that are surrounding this park, right? And so it's equity within limits in that sense. And we see that as well in the United States, this legacy of environmental toxics. In this image that I like to bring, which is just a juxtaposition from two time periods in New Orleans, you have on the left, Claiborne Avenue, which used to be like a Rambla, very much like a Rambla that we have in Spain. And it was very much a space used by the African American residents living in Treme, which is historically an African American settlement. But then that green space was destroyed and replaced by this gigantic I-20 highway, which crosses Treme, divides Treme in two, and really scars and traumatizes the neighborhood. And so it has, even when there was access to green space 50, 40 years ago, under politics of urban renewal and this massive infrastructure development that we saw in many American cities, green spaces became unequal. And now, actually, interestingly enough, there are proposals floating around in New Orleans to replace this highway by a Rambla again, like bringing it back to what it used to be, with, of course, a lot of material destruction, a lot of large infrastructure redevelopment that many residents are critiquing, saying, you know, first of all, the pollution that would come from that infrastructure demolition and reconstruction would be massive. And the way that the project, the new green project, is being branded is branding as kind of a middle class, creative class type of infrastructure to attract new investment and new residents to Treme, to whiten Treme, if you wish. And so what we see now in this kind of reconstruction of the green city, or the amplification of the green city, is that green planning faces a form of green paradox because of how environmental privilege and urban growth are codependent, in the sense that despite promises and despite commitments for or by city makers to create green cities for all and to articulate benefits that can, let's say, create value, create better health, better recreation for residents, actually we see an inequity problem because of this embedment of urban growth, unequal investment that privileges higher income residents and larger scale investors. Hence, then the broader argument of the book, which is despite needs for urban greening and its multiple co-benefits, green infrastructure can recreate green Lulus in racially mixed and working class neighborhoods. And so the main theory, or the main, let's say, theoretical acknowledgement of the book has to do with green gentrification, environmental gentrification, more broadly speaking, which was defined in 2009 by Sarah Dooling as the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. The environmental ethic being what I was describing earlier, right? That green infrastructure is beneficial for everything, for climate adaptation, for climate mitigation, for health, for place attachment, for economic development, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's seen as a panacea to resolve a lot of urban problems. And then we even kind of amplify this literature by talking about green climate gentrification in some ways. The fact that as cities are trying to create more resilient urban landscapes, urban infrastructure, this is also embedded with climate gentrification, meaning that working class and racialized minorities are the groups, are the residents that are most likely to experience residential and social displacement from green climate infrastructure and its associated gentrification risks. And you can see an image in the background of the Boston Harbor Plan, which was a plan that the city of Boston unraveled in 2018 to literally green the entire waterfront. So we're talking here about 60 kilometers of the entire Boston waterfront and the neighborhoods that are part of that waterfront: South Boston, East Boston, Charlestown, etc. But what we see in that plan is that actually that plan is being capitalized upon by investors, by real estate investors who are building luxury housing right next to the green infrastructure, or even privately financing the green infrastructure. And then if you look at a few streets behind, you actually have both a recreation of vulnerability because of the slopes of this very resilient infrastructure. So meaning that, for example, no, I don't have, I should have left a slide where you see a very luxurious building built on a hill that the developer built, let's say, in a superficial way to, in a way, prevent residents from being affected by sea level rise and flooding. But then the way that the slope then works out is that it creates, let's say, a flooding path outside this resilient infrastructure towards the adjacent homes and housing. And we're talking here about public housing in particular, and the housing of working class residents, right? And so residents are more exposed to climate impacts at the same time as they see these very luxurious, very resilient islands, if you want, islands of resilience next to them that are also increasing housing prices. And so that's jeopardizing their ability to stay in the neighborhood. We also see that in general, these green inequalities are recreated or created by the ability of cities to brand themselves as green, right? There's a very strong green branding articulated by cities, places like Vancouver, places like Nantes, places like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, etc., where greening is part of the identity of the city, the way it is sold outside to investors, to competitors, to future residents. But what we have seen, not only in the book, but in other research linked to the book, in the 99 cities that are part of the broader project that underpins the book, is that high levels of urban green boosterism are strongly associated with high levels of unaffordability, meaning that at the end of the day, who has access to the benefits of green infrastructure? It's the elites who are able to stay and remain or move to those green neighborhoods. And so the process that we dig a little bit more into in the book is that of green grabbing logic that also my colleague Melissa Garcia Lamarca develops in another article, which is that banks, other types of investors, real estate developers, real estate agents, and also the creative class or the, let's say, higher income class of residents around them are working with a green grabbing logic, where there's a value appropriation of green amenities. There's also a rent extraction because of the properties and because of the different goods that are being built and financed next to the green infrastructure. And also there is an ability of those investors or developers, for example, to brand their properties, their goods in ways that will increase their attractiveness thanks to greening. And so in some ways, they shape and they respond to consumer demand, but who can live in a studio apartment that costs $1,500, $2,000, more or less the equivalent of 1,300 euros or 1,800 euros for maybe a one bedroom, or again, the sustainability class that's able to finance and to pay for those increased goods. And then at the end of the day, what do those developers also do? And the real estate, let's say, machine around them is to capture for themselves the social and the health benefits of greening. So they, in a way, have been able to appropriate those discourses. And then finally, what we look at very much in detail in the book is how greening is racialized, how greening is a form of white supremacy with green gentrification that illustrates physical, financial, and social cultural displacement. And there, what happens is a form of land grabbing of many territories, neighborhoods, neighborhood spaces, both for greening and for housing that were the spaces of racialized minorities. I'm talking here about parks, I'm talking here about greenways, but I'm also talking about community gardens that are being transformed into those green spaces or those green infrastructure in ways that long-time residents or immigrant residents do not feel comfortable being there anymore. They feel that their practices are being excluded. And at the same time, their own housing is being demolished, as you can see here on the top picture. We are talking here about a development called Berry Farm, which was a large-scale public housing development in Anacostia, which is a historically Black neighborhood of Washington, D.C. This entire development of 400 families was demolished in 2019. All of the residents have been expelled, and now it's going to be replaced by a mixed income housing that is very much oriented towards green space, active living, mobility with bikes, etc. So kind of this big package, this green package, if you will, that's often being sold to higher class residents. And so beyond, in a way, those kind of theoretical threads that we are pulling in the book and around which the book is built, then we, of course, focus on different, let's say, trends of inequalities and each of those trends, which are different parts of the book. So here, for example, part 1 is illustrated by a variety of cities. So part 1 is about the social costs of glitzy green urbanism, Milan, Valencia, Amsterdam, or Bristol. And so here in particular, what do you see? You see a very strong aestheticization of green, a manicured green, green being very much part of new design and artistic creations that are creating a new form of value, attractiveness for the neighborhood, and that are often accompanied, as we can see in Milan on the left side of the slide, by high-end luxury housing, which is supposed to be green, right? But then what about the consumption practices of residents? Of course, no one looks at that. Then we have part 2 of the book, which is about compounded risks and impacts of urban greening in post-industrial environments. Here we look at Dallas, Glasgow, San Francisco, Seattle, and Cleveland. And I forgot to say that in each part of the book, or in each tale, if you will, we have this historical perspective of a particular neighborhood, because what we want to show is how there was a strong legacy of lack of access to greening that's being then transformed, that's being then recuperated and upgraded into much more of a green perspective, a green neighborhood, but then, of course, with different types of inequalities. And so what we see here, for example, so these are all examples of neighborhoods that are very post-industrial neighborhoods, vacant space, former factories, former shipyard industries, a lot of gray infrastructure that is now being very much transformed into green living. But what we see is for marginalized residents, they are still exposed to the environmental toxics that those neighborhoods had. And I'm giving you the example here, for example, of Dallas, which is the top left photo, where there are still toxic industries, or in the bottom photos, you still have shipyard industries that are impacting the residents, but they're also exposed to the inequalities coming from this green infrastructure development. So there's kind of these compounded environmental risks that residents have to confront. Legacy of industrial toxics combined with new kind of polished green or glitzy green that comes and is being plastered onto certain parts of their neighborhoods. Part 3, here we have a very strong racialized lens. We are looking at historically, in general, Black neighborhoods or Latinx neighborhoods that are being impacted by the green city. Washington, I talked a little bit about Washington earlier, Atlanta, Austin, and Boston, where not only is there a class exclusion based on income or based on the incapacity to confront the increasing property value, housing values of a green neighborhood, but also there's a sense that there's a whitening of green practices, meaning that you feel welcome in a space, in a green space, if you abide by the norms, by the type of behavior that is being changed in that space, and that's being very much white-coded behavior, right? So some types of more, for example, some immigrant practices that used to be very much tolerated or welcomed in a particular neighborhood are now being criminalized or surveilled or controlled. Again, Washington, Atlanta, Austin, and Boston. And you can see here some of the spaces, some of the parks that I'm talking about, like the one on the bottom right in Boston, where previous soccer or previous football activities are being replaced by leagues, sport leagues, by much more white and much upper class residents. On the top right picture, you see the Beltline of Atlanta, which is the focus of the Atlanta chapter. The Beltline used to be a merchandise transport infrastructure that was converted into a green belt that kind of loops around the city and creates new type of transport infrastructure as well. But what you can see is that the use for recreation of the green belt is predominantly white. So in that sense, who has access to green space are the new whiter residents coming to live in the proximity to this green and transport infrastructure. In part 4, we look at how greening is also entangled with other gentrification pressures. For example, food gentrification in Montreal, like an entire green landscape of canal cleanup and redevelopment, new green streets, community gardens, all of those are now being practiced, let's say, by higher income or used by higher income residents. But on top of it, different sources of food, so in the gardens, in food co-ops, in stores, or even food pantries are disappearing in this broader greening of the neighborhood. And we see the same in Dublin, in Philadelphia, or Barcelona. And I'll talk about Dublin in a little bit, in more detail. And then finally, we have part 5, which is a little bit more upbeat and looks at green justice victories and gray zones in the just green city. And here we bring in Copenhagen, Nantes, Vienna, and Portland as cities that have been able to maintain some form of justice, inclusivity, as they've become greener. But even despite that, those cities are at risk of greater or stronger green gentrification. And again, I'm going to bring in an example in a minute. And these are some of those examples of cities. So yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay. So the part that I wanted to talk more here in detail is the one on complex entanglement of greening and multiple other gentrification pressures and Dublin. So the title of the Dublin chapter was Environmental Inequities in Fast-Growing Dublin, Combined Scarcity of Green Space and Affordable Housing for the Liberties. And here, the entanglement of greening has to do with tourism-driven gentrification. So what is the Liberties? The Liberties is a historically working class neighborhood where residents from more white Irish backgrounds have been living mostly for the last 100 years and been working in the many factories that the neighborhood has had. For example, the Guinness factory might have been one of those sites that when you went to Dublin, you visited. Well, the Guinness factory was a site also a very strong it was a very strong workplace and also a place of unionization and very strong protection also, if you will, of workers by the owners of the factory. And now that the factory has become a bit more of a tourism site, and that in general, as in many other cities, industrial uses have moved outside of the city, those residents have seen their sources of income very much fade away or being weakened. And so that's an example of the landscape that you see, kind of older housing combined with this public housing, very little access to green space. The Liberties is known as having the least amount of green space in Ireland, and also is now plagued by numerous empty or derelict sites. However, because of the amount of derelict sites, and also the proximity to the center of the city, the Liberties is also now seeing a huge construction boom around high-end student residences, as well as tourism businesses and hotels. And so greening is now embedded into a broader context of housing crisis and international tech and student-driven real estate speculation and gentrification. Just before the pandemic, 2018, the prices in this district where the Liberties is located, which is Dublin 8, were up to 7%, while overall in Dublin, there were 30,000 units vacant. So as we call that at the beginning of the chapter, there are two concurrent historic crises in Dublin: greening and housing, lack of greening and housing together. In 2015, to respond to this lack of both green space, trees, playgrounds, and even healthy food, the Dublin City Council designed and published the Liberties Greening Strategy, with the claim that with population densities as high as 18,000 residents per square kilometers, the inner city has a social, economic, indeed moral claim for a substantially greater green investment. And so what you can see here is that the idea is to construct more parks and gardens, to also have planting of trees and greater street trees in particular, and sustain some of the green spaces that residents were trying to build, including community gardens or allotment gardens. And so one of the main victories of the green strategy has been Weaver Park, which is a really fantastic multi-use park in the middle of the neighborhood. It's very vibrant. It's very much used by a variety of residents, and it was built thanks to the mobilization of many mothers and many students who were demanding and who designed the park. So that was really a great success. There is another park that's being built, that's almost finished, which is called Bridgefoot Park, which is on the other side of the community. But what you can already see here is that you have these student housing on the left, these new kind of gray and brown building, where when I did my interviews in Dublin, it was very clear that those were going to capitalize mostly on the green space, not necessarily the residents. And many of the community gardens that existed in this space that you see in the middle that were resident driven have not, let's say, been replaced by new green spaces in part of in the new park. There will be some, but it will be very different. It will be much more kind of managed centrally. Some of the other pictures about Weaver Park. Interestingly enough, in Weaver Park, you also had very close to Weaver Park small community gardens, and those are gone now. And so you have again here this tension between larger public sponsored, very manicured green spaces and the more informal community resident driven spaces that do not have that same legitimacy and that have had to go in that process. And they've had to go, thankfully, at least not for tourism uses or let's say for high-end residents. In that case, the Weaver Square community gardens were replaced or are being replaced by public housing. But again, we're not talking about a lot of units, and it is still a city that has 30,000 vacant units. So did you need to get rid of community gardens in a city that's very gray, or at least in a part of the city that's very gray? Probably not. And so what we see also when I did my interviews with investors and real estate developers is that the greening strategy is legitimizing and helping to market high-end student housing. So if you go to the Liberties now, you see dozens of high-end gigantic projects of student housing that are very private, that are very international investment driven. And you also see a lot of high-end hotels. And so in the end, you have this juxtaposition of international tourists and visitors that are living in housing that residents could be or should be living in, but that are not easily convertible. Because actually, one of the reasons why student housing is so popular now, especially this kind of global student housing, is that they do not have to abide by planning laws that often require a certain amount or a certain percentage of units to be for social housing, that they don't have to abide by. And they also do not have to respect sizes of spaces. And so they can be very small spaces. They might have fewer windows, they might have fewer balconies, but that's okay because it's a student housing or it's a hotel. And so that really makes a huge profit margin being possible for the investors and for the developers. And then what is also interesting in these kind of waves of redevelopment is that, you know, greening paves the ways, or let's say accompanies student housing and hotel housing, but then it's also the entry gate to new transnational tech-led development. And so you have this first legitimacy stage that then opens the door to a whole other, let's say, huge bubble of real estate speculation in a neighborhood. Just this quote here, the greening strategy was to make it look like this is a good idea for you to invest in, build your student accommodation here, because next door you're going to get a park. You're going to get a nice tourist trial. We're going to clean up the mess and nothing for the residents. And then what you also see is that some of the green spaces that were built very close to or within even those large student or hotel complexes are being privatized. So even though they were supposed to be open to the community, they are now being gated in a context of this neoliberalized green space construction, which is the city council also washing its hands and saying, we're going to build a few parks, but the rest can be financed and built by developers. But then, yeah, of course, developers in that sense have the capacity to decide on the rules for how those spaces are being used and open. And in the meantime, you still have a little bit at what you have in other cities. You have still a lot of industrialized land, industrialized landscapes and facilities in the middle of the Liberties. So in the end, are we moving towards a dichotomous greenish neighborhood with only recent housing, with very little housing organizing capacity? What I'm saying here, and I should maybe have added another slide, is that there is very little housing organizing in Dublin, and what exists is very recent. And so residents are not able to kind of articulate a counter argument against greening, or even in general against speculation, because historically the labor movement and the housing movement has been very much delegitimized and even buried by other forms of politics and organizing in the Irish community, including what we know, like the political religious conflicts between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it's really interesting to hear some of the testimonies of residents saying, you know, we've been so focused on our internal wars of identity, who's Protestant, who's Catholic, who is pro-England, who is pro-Republic of Ireland, that we've forgotten the immediateness of what falls in front of us, which is our right to housing, which are our daily lives that are being jeopardized in front of us. And in some way, it's interesting because it reminds me, in different ways also, of the Catalan conflict and the ways in which sometimes, supranational politics mean that your local organizing capacity around environment, labor laws, etc., might not be as, let's say, prominent, or might not be given as much support. Then the second example I wanted to focus on very briefly, and then I'll stop, is in the last part on fragile green victories, which is Nantes. And here the question is, will extraordinary gardens and social housing ensure Nantes is green and affordable for all? And so Nantes is, to the contrary of Dublin, a very green and very blue city throughout. And there has been a huge effort of the municipality over the last 30 years to reconnect residents with their two rivers, and also to transform the space in the middle, which is called the island of Nantes, the Ile de Nantes, into an eco-district, a more social-oriented eco-district with different uses, with different industries, with different economic and social and cultural activities, and almost make this a new center for the city. And so Nantes residents have benefited from a huge increase in green space, plus 200% between 1984 and 2015. All residents are now living within 300 meters of a green area. And there has been a lot of focus on those social eco-districts, not the types of maybe more Northern Europe type of eco-districts where very, very trendy, very eco-design, very artistic types of eco-districts are attracting very different classes of residents. What Nantes also has is the redevelopment of large areas through a mechanism called the ZAC. And the ZAC are the denomination or the zoning of large-scale areas into top-down, or let's say municipal and metropolitan planned areas to be redeveloped and in many ways greened. And so here, rather than projects being decided by or proposed, let's say, by developers on kind of one-on-one basis and having a lot of, in many cases, land speculation associated with them, you have the government who is really guiding the process and who is deciding where different uses are going to be transformed into, which has really guaranteed, I would say, a balance between social uses and green space, and also in general, the incorporation of public and affordable housing. And that's really, really important, because Nantes, for every 100 units being built, 56 of them are either public or affordable housing. And so you might have green gentrification in Nantes, but you do not have the form of displacement, if you will, that you see in many other cities. And so Nantes is a municipality that integrates social equity and health in greening to control cost of living since the start. It has had this equity focus, not a posteriori, like many cities that we have in our book, but actually really from the beginning. And that's very, very important. You can see, for example, here some of the public housing that the city has built, or the eco districts, like the one on the bottom left, where each of the residents has access to this farming space. And that's really, really well done in that sense. A lot of spaces co-managed, co-designed with residents. That was a little exhibit as part of a festival that residents were part of to sew cushions and bring cushions to these to one of the parks of the city, and kind of to make this puffin a little bit more comfortable. That was a really neat project in some ways. And yet, what we see in Nantes, that's why we call that a fragile victory, is that greening has moved away slowly since the 90s, since the 2000s, and especially in the last 5 years, from being very much of a social good for current residents to this attractive tool for bringing in tourists and visitors. And you can see here is a park, which is called the Jardin Extraordinaire on the left, that was built on a former quarry, and that will now also receive on the right, the Arbre au Héron, the heron tree. It's a 50 million euro project. It's very much of an art piece. It has nothing really natural, if you will, about it. And it is meant as a tourism attraction. And it's very manicured green. It's very artistic green. So many residents are also questioning, like, what are the uses that we're going to make of those green spaces? We can walk, as you can see, the two people on the left, on very specific bridges and paths. But it's a very passive use of green space. It's a very manicured use of green space. And there's a lot of money, of course, embedded in this greening. A lot of companies being asked to finance the Arbre au Héron, the Jardin Extraordinaire. And at the end of the day, there is then a much broader kind of capital campaign being sought for in Nantes. So our conclusion: what is the new tale for the green city? What type of tale can we bring for the green city to make it more just? And our argument here is that we need a conscious push towards anti-subordination, intersectional and relational form of greening, meaning that greening must take some emancipatory forms, especially so in neighborhoods that were historically racialized, neighborhoods that were forgotten on the map. There must be some ways for greening to become this tool for empowerment, and also for creating new relationships between people, their territory, and their land, and looking at it in an intersectional manner, meaning looking at different identities and vulnerabilities at the same time, and also considering people's relations to the land, especially non-profit, non-consumeristic relationships to the land. And so what we have proposed in the final chapter is a mix of anti-displacement and equitable green development tools that planners and also community activists can use to try to develop a greener and more just green city. We also have a separate report outside the book, which is called the Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice, which we released in April last year, that has a look at these different tools. So in conclusion, in racialized contexts in particular, greening must not overlook the deep segregationist and exclusionary legacies of racial settlement and their ongoing manifestations. And decolonizing the green city means centering land recognition, redistribution, control, and even reparations as necessary to an emancipatory and environmentally just landscapes. And if you want different types of reading or understanding of those dynamics, we have also a documentary that we are building that's called The Green Divide. That's also on our website, and that brings in some of the cities. We examine Boston, Barcelona, Nantes, Washington, Portland, and Montreal. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabelle, for this wonderful presentation. And of course, congratulations for the book and for your contribution of you and your team. So thank you very much. We now have about 10 to 15 minutes of space for questions. So I invite the audience, if you want to ask any question. I have some here, but I will reserve them for later if necessary. Okay, then Mikel Ortega, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabelle, for the talk. It's a very concrete question. It's about the tools that you have very briefly mentioned now. What I want to ask you is basically in relation with taxation. Have you had any sort of analysis of good practices in relation with taxation, so at least you can use this tool, which in theory it's it's quick to implement if you want to avoid speculation, etc. In comparison with public housing, for example, it's one that you have mentioned. But of course, this is extremely difficult, especially in the spaces where everything is already built. But taxation is much quicker. So may you explain us if you have any sort of good practices that you can explain to avoid at least the speculation part of these processes. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right. The taxation is something much easier to put in place. And also you don't require as much funding and as much change in land use regulations, for example. In Philadelphia, in Boston, you have something that's called the development tax, which for mid-size development projects, developers are being taxed. And then this tax goes, or the tax benefits, or the funds themselves go into a land bank that redevelops vacant land thanks to this tax. So that works very well. Vancouver has a tax on vacant units because it's also a space where, or it's a city with huge amount of transnational investment that is being just, people are just buying condos and homes, but they are not living in them. So there's a tax on vacant land. There are also taxes, for example, on, that's what Barcelona has, right? The tourist tax for hotel stays and in general, like the industry that's linked to tourism. And so that's also another possible tax. There are different taxes as well. For example, developers have vacant land that they have bought and they are not building on. They are waiting for better times. And so tax on vacant land as well could be really of help. So anyway, yeah, you have different actors that you can target, and that's being already put in place. And then the money goes again to the redevelopment of vacant land, to public housing, for example. And so, so you have the taxes this way, but then you also have tax breaks, where then you give tax breaks to residents in particularly vulnerable positions. So in Philadelphia, in neighborhoods that have very quickly gentrified in the 2010s, the city is giving tax breaks to lower income residents, saying, even though we know that your property tax, so let's say the EB, right, in Spain, even though we know that your EB has raised tremendously, and here we're talking about a raise from maybe 2,000 a year to 10,000 a year, we're going to give you a tax breaks for 5 years or 10 years, because we know that otherwise you cannot afford it knowing your income.
Thank you, Isabelle and Michael. Now we have another question from Ali Healy. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Isabelle. I'll try and put on my camera for 1 second if I can. Here I am. Hello. That was really interesting. I just want to say thank you so much. I think this research is so relevant, and it really relates a lot with the problem that's unfolding on the Wild Coast in South Africa, where I've been doing some research lately, because not only is the state trying to, commit a land grab and an ocean grab for titanium mining and now gas and oil, but part of those plans are trying to impose a smart city, or what they're calling a green city or a smart city, in a protected area of the coast. And the rumor is, and we haven't been able to find any formal confirmation, is that some people from the London School of Economics Cities Group are consulting on this project with the provincial government of KwaZulu Natal. So that's something that I'm trying to find out, because surely it is the colonized version of the green city is going to be implemented. There is going to be complete insensitivity to issues around land and land claims and redistribution and reparations. All of that is just going to be swept under a rug somewhere, and lots of people are going to line their pockets in the government and get very, very rich along with their friends in the corporate world. So I'm not sure if I actually have a question, except to say thank you. And I think this is an avenue that I'm, going to be following, and your work as a resource, I think I'm going to be drawing on, because I think activists in South Africa don't know. They're still very much bamboozled by this idea that there is some sort of high-tech silver bullet that's going to uplift everyone out of poverty and create this sort of bastion of prosperity and wealth. And I think it's a myth that needs to be smashed really hard and really fast.
Yeah, especially in societies or in cities that are already so unequal and so segregated, like.
Yeah, and the cities that are
Urban
there
South
just don't
Africa.
have basic services already, right? So there's no sort of retrospective approach. There's no like, let's green what we've already got. It's let's just build a new city and get filthy rich doing it and screw everybody else. So yeah, I mean, if you have any leads or any other resources to share, I've been taking screenshots of all the stuff that you've shared already. So thanks for that. But let's stay in touch. Other in context, I'd be really interested to carry on those conversations.
Thank you. There is not enough research done in the global south on global south cities, and that's one of our sins. I will say that the project was based, I wrote it to be Northern Europe or Europe and North America, because there is a strong part that was quantitative and demographic data driven, and we knew that we would have access to data in an easier way in those places. But I think what you describe is super important. If you want to have a look, we also have written that, like, students in the lab have written about greening in Rio, in the favelas, and then also in Medellin with the green belt and those types of kind of smart city rhetorics as well. So if that can be of help to just consider other global south context.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both. I think we still have time for one quick question from Ignacy, and then we can close the session. Thank you.
Ignacy.
Thanks, Isabelle. It's been a very interesting presentation. You provided an overview of the question of environmental gentrification. My question would be, you also mentioned that you have worked on equitable green development tools and a policy guidance. Could you develop a bit more on solutions on how to prevent this green gentrification? You already mentioned taxation, but probably there are some other interesting tools or aspects that you could identify.
I'm going to paste. Well, I'll do it after. I was trying to quickly look for the report itself, because I know that I brushed very quickly on it. So in the tools, I mean, I'm happy. Just let me reshare for just 30 seconds. So in the report that you see, we had these two different types of tools, right? So we had anti-gentrification, anti-displacement in particular, and then more improved or increasingly inclusive greening. And so the tools we have are, for example, land use tools in the anti-displacement one. We can think about community land trusts, for example, or we can have the instrument that I described in France, the ZAC. Then we have developer requirements and support tools, which is, okay, you want to build there? Well, this is what you're going to have to do. Either have 30, 40, 50% of the housing that should be social or public housing, or you're going to have to also build a park next to the housing, and it has to be public, and it has to be open, it has to be just available for residents. And you also have different other types of requirements. Then you also have the housing schemes focused at homeowners. And so here, what I was talking about earlier, property tax breaks, or support to pay your taxes. So that's also another option, where you have grants that you can apply to have a tax break in your housing if you are living in a gentrifying neighborhoods. Then you have the financial tools aimed at renters. Those could be land control, those could be rent control or rent decreases, or there could be vouchers to help pay rent as well. And then you have the community-focused financial schemes. Those are those that are part of community land trust, for example. And then you have other types of regulations and ordinances, for example, a moratorium on new hotel construction or moratoriums on new student residence constructions, etc. And then you have the other tools, which again are looking at the same domains and have to do with creating more inclusive green amenities. And so there as well, for example, green bonds are a tool that we look at, and green bonds have a bit of a double-edged sword, because the other types of bonds that municipalities emit for investors to buy, and then with those bonds bought or with the funds, you can support, for example, community-based greening or community-based adaptation projects. So that would be great, except that for now, those bonds are more for types of greenwashing projects, or at least what we have seen in places like Gothenburg. So let me try to put the link again to the report as we finish up. That's it. I wasn't going to say more.
Okay, there's the link. Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you, Ignacy. So we are at the end of this session. Once again, thank you very much, Isabelle, for being here. Always a pleasure. We our next Pensament, our next online talk will be on the 23rd of February, and we'll focus on the challenges associated with the management of waste and resources in Catalonia. So for that, we have the participation of Josep Maria Tost i Borràs, the former director of the Catalan Waste Agency. So in Catalan, the title of this presentation of February presentation is Reptes de la gestió de residus i recursos a Catalunya, amb Josep Maria Tost i Borràs, l'ex-director de l'Agència de Residus de Catalunya. Thank you very much all for being here. Isabelle, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. All the best for this new year.
Thanks, Isabelle.